Elliot, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today. Um, $3.5 billion is what the childcare sector got in the federal stimulus. The childcare sector had asked for $50 billion.
Mm-hmm.
We're well aware of what's happening with childcare right now in terms of the just complete loss of so much capacity given the COVID-19 pandemic. What happened in terms of Congress's interest and support for funding at the level that the sector requested?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, first of all, and it's great to be able to chat about this. I think what happened is what we've seen over and over and over again over the past couple of decades, which is that childcare does not have the political weight in the political sphere that many other sectors do. And so, despite the voices being heard loud and clear in the number of op-eds that have been media, the number of stories that have been out there about the child care crisis, specifically as it relates to COVID-19, you didn't see the muscles or moving the flywheel, as it were. And the piece that I wrote basically posits that there are three main reasons for that. And if you broadly look at the literature about advocacy and what makes effective advocacy happen, you have to have one of two and sort of three things. Number one, you could do it with money, right? And so corporations do this all the time. If you can, throw campaign donations around, and if you can hire a lot of high-powered lobbyists and all of that, then you can usually get your interests heard. And number two is if you don't have a lot of money, what you can do is you can have a lot of people, right? You can have such an organized constituency that an elected leader sort of has to listen because their incentives are, I'm going to either get voted out of office or I'm going to be so flooded by actions, I'm going to get such negative press, all the rest of it, that's going to be bad for me. And this is sort of the Marshall Gans kind of league of organizing that has led to the United Farm Workers and lots of other sort of historical effective organizing campaigns that didn't have a lot of money. And so the problem with childcare, in a sense, is despite having many wonderful, hardworking advocates, and I want to say up front that I am not trying to cast aspersions on anyone, because there are people who have been doing this for a long time with very, very little and making pretty heroic gains despite the odds. But childcare sort of sits in this weird spot where it doesn't have a lot of money, doesn't have a lot of people behind it in an organized way. And then the third piece of this is messaging wise. The story that is told isn't necessarily as compelling as some of the other stories because it's a little bit isolated from the broader conversation about children and families. It sort of focuses on one narrow age group in one narrow sector.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that is also interesting in terms of being in a weird place is that childcare workers are typically not in K through 12 unions, for example. Right. They're typically not associated with the K through 12 system. They're also not associated with other low-wage workers and the organizations that support other low-wage workers. So can you just talk about that weird place as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you look at the K12 education, and while it is certainly could be and should be funded better, it gets a significant oomph, right? We spend $700 billion a year nationally at all levels on K12 education. We're above average in terms of like developed nations and the percentage of GDP that we spend on it. It is the largest line item or one of the largest line items in almost every state budget. Part of the reason for that is because we have powerful unions. And the NEA has been around since the mid 1850s, and both the NEA and the AFT have contributions. They make political contributions in the tens of millions of dollars each year, and that gives them some clout. And on the other hand, and again, so that's the money power, and then the organizing power. When you think about the SEIUs of the world, with these groups that are bringing together home healthcare workers, fast food workers, hotel, staff, those sorts of traditional professions, and you strengthen numbers, right? Like there are a lot of those, and they're able to organize them, and they're able to, again, create these campaigns that are very sophisticated and that leverage the collective power, so that when you look at like the Fight for 15 that the fast food workers did, and then the home health care workers got in on that as well, like they were very successful because they had a very clear message, and they were able to sort of wield the power of these millions and millions of employees in very strategic ways. And so again, childcare is an interesting spot because, you know, you look at the power of the profession, which has some really good thinking behind it, and that basically says we should be treated like childcare and early care providers should be treated like K12 practitioners. But there's no equivalent of an NEA or an AFT for childcare. It's not even close. NAEYC, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which is sort of the leading interest group, is not a union. It has 60,000 members. The NEA has over 3 million members. So talking about multiple orders of magnitude of difference. But again, if you want to be treated like K12 educator, and so you want to be paid like middle class wages, then it doesn't make as much sense to align yourself with the fast food workers who are just trying to make $15 an hour. That kind of puts you in a weird philosophical spot. So yeah, so I kind of mentioned the piece. We're kind of in a no man's land where we're not on either side, and as a result, I think we get much less sort of effective clout than we would otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, I've always sort of been somewhat skeptical about whether or not the alignment with K through 12 educators is the right alignment, right? Because there are carers in many other disciplines and sectors who actually do make middle class wages, right? You think about nurses, for example, right? And I'm just wondering, like, from your perspective, what's the reason for focusing on that alignment versus focusing on other potential alignments, solidarity that can be built with other sectors and industries where frankly there's still a whole lot of care being given?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think reasonable people can reasonably disagree on this one. I think there is certainly a case to be made that if the difference between, a first grade teacher and a teacher of a toddler is simply 4 years of age, but they're both fundamentally, cultivating that child's development for their future, educational attainment and their future life success, and you're shaping who they are, then like that work is fundamentally the same, and so they should be paid, equivalently, and they should be paid. They should have equivalent, expectations for their educational background of teachers. Right? You can make that argument easily. You can also flip around and say early childhood is a developmentally distinct period from middle childhood and adolescence, and so actually what goes into that looks a little bit different than what goes into formal schooling, and that means that we need to have sort of a lot of different care options. And if you're gonna have a lot of different care options, which are gonna include, family childcare homes, are gonna include parental care, grandparent care, and if all of those are totally legitimate options, then is that actually an exact mirror of the K-12 system? Where I come down is personally, I think there's probably a bridge to it. Like, I actually think the idea that just because someone doesn't have a bachelor's degree, and isn't teaching a classroom means that that the sort of ceiling we should be looking at is $15 an hour. I actually think to some things that you've written, it's more about how we devalue care. Like, rather than say, we want child care workers to all be treated exactly the same as K-12 workers. I don't know that we need care workers to be like, well, there should not be any kind of care workers making less than middle class wages, right? Like, it's that is our argument, that we need to get them up to $15 an hour instead of making like $11 an hour. To me, in some way, reflects the lack of imagination or a lack of a vision towards the idea that we shouldn't have anyone who is caring for our children or our elders making less than solid middle class wages. And that puts you again in an interesting space where if you're fighting for that, you almost need to create the solidarity with the other care workers, but take some of the sort of vision and goals of the teachers unions and kind of merge them.
Yeah.
But it is complex work. The other thing I mentioned in the piece is, right, like public schools are public schools. Whether it's in North Carolina or Virginia or where we are, whether it's in, Maine or Wyoming, like they're public schools. Care is provided in so many different settings, private settings, public settings, nonprofits.
Right.
businesses, right? Like it's single owner operated family cares, large center chains. Like it's much more complicated to say we're going to speak with one voice, and we're going to advocate for the same thing. And so some of that I think is also going to mean some hard conversations about what is the future of the sector going to look like.
And by the sector here, we mean the childcare sector specifically. Of course, you and I have talked about how the childcare sector is really a subset within this broader but somewhat ambiguous sector that we sometimes refer to as early childhood. But what I've also been interested to see, Elliot, is how, for example, home visitors, maybe they see themselves in early childhood, but they may also see themselves more in a maternal and child health
Yes.
space. And so I think part of what we need to get better at is really defining all of the various sectors that contribute to the well-being and flourishing of our youngest children, and not artificially narrow the 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 group of people and sectors who can contribute to the well-being of children, and thus in that way build some solidarity across many more sectors and industries that are contributing to the welfare of our kids.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's interesting that for a very long time, right? Like you think about like home visitors or paid family leave, I think is another good example of this, right? Like if you think about an arc of a sort of family's life from the time they have a baby, on, you can reasonably, if you step back, say there should be, essentially like a continuum, right? Where maybe the first year, there's the parents fully paid family leave, like we see in many European nations, where the parents can provide care, and then that transitions into some kind of early care settings. And meanwhile, underneath it, you've got the home visitors and other parental supports. You have healthcare that's going on there for parents and children. Like there are all of these components of it, and then we sort of pick apart, like, okay, paid family leave is over here and minimum wage is over there, and the childcare subsidy is over on this side of things, and so it becomes very muddled. And I think that is partly a historical legacy of where these different fields have come up, and where these different sort of sub sectors or roles have developed. But I think it's one that we need to really be putting on the table, especially right now, because with every part of the sort of early people trying to help in early childhood suffering right now with a childcare crisis that is, I mean, the entire system is on the verge of collapse at the moment. Now more than ever is the time, I think, to step back and say this isn't working. If given one of the most sort of horrific circumstances we could imagine, and with so much of a spotlight being shown on how important childcare is and how fragile childcare is, and with everyone under the sun, governors, everyone saying this is essential, we can still get less than a tenth of what advocates are asking for. 3.5 billion out of a $2 trillion stimulus.
Yeah.
That I think is sort of should be the nail in the coffin of our current or strategies, of trying to make change.
So on that, it seems like there might be other opportunities as soon as the end of April for Congress to infuse more money into the economy, into various systems and sectors that need an infusion of cash right now. There's obviously a long game that we need to play in terms of building money power, messaging power, people power in the childcare space. But what do you think we could do in the next 3 to 4 weeks
Yeah.
to position for advocates to be better positioned to get more money out of the phase? I've heard various numbers, but at least phase 3, phase 4, maybe even phase 5 stimulus.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will put the caveat here that like this is not the work I am like deeply entrenched in. So there may be some of this going on already that I'm just not aware of, and so I don't want to sort of be a spectator throwing stones. But I do think that this is the time to do a couple of things. One is to get those principles of all of those groups we just talked about in a room and figure out how do we kind of put differences aside and speak with one voice. And so you're talking about the home visitors, the home health aides, the child care workers of all stripes. I think it's time to stop caring for the moment about whether you're a private, for-profit, or whether you're a community-based nonprofit. The other thing I think is there needs to be some rapid activation of parents. So we haven't talked about that yet, but that's another thing I talked about in the piece is that the constituency for these services are parents and grandparents, and there are millions of them. There are 21 million parents or 20 million children under the age of 5 in this country. So it gives you some sense of the size of the number of parents and grandparents especially grandparents who currently are home. And if they're anything like my parents, they're kind of a little stir crazy, not being able to see their grandchildren, and so they might be very, very happy to do something to help them. And so that sort of rapid activation, um, and there are groups like out there that are trying to do this. And so if we can get some better alignment, because I do think that we need to be flooding the phone lines of Congress people about this issue. Like they need to understand that like come November, voters are going to be paying attention to whether or not they acted now to salvage, families with children and the services that they need to be able to survive and thrive. And then I think the other piece of it I would like to see is I would honestly like to see the business community step up a little bit more too. Now that we're starting to see, knowing how much the economic recovery is going to be dependent on childcare. That's more of the money power than the people power. But I think that's another place where if parents can advocate with their employers to be, talking to their chambers of commerce, talking to their elected officials as well. Like that's another angle. This is a long way of saying like all hands on deck. Like this is a 5 alarm fire, and we need to be directing every bit of energy that we have to making sure that childcare gets what it needs, and all those family, sort of subsectors we just mentioned, get what they need in this next phase. Because I am very concerned about what is going to happen if they don't, both in the short, medium, and long term. I think it's going to be a lot of harm done to not just practitioners, but honestly children and families. That doesn't need to happen if we can act with one voice and show them that we have the muscle that they need to really be sort of responding to.
Great. Elliot, thanks so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
I
Appreciate it.
appreciate your time.